Welcome everyone to another Rising Tide Talk. I'm Matt, Roleplay Chat Capelli, and today we're going to be talking about playtesting your tabletop role-playing game. So today we're joined by a storyteller, game designer, writer, and playtester who has worked in all sorts of spaces within the TTRPG space, currently working with MCDM with credits in the Kingdom and Warfare, Arcadia, Flea Mortals, and many, many other books and games. Please join me in welcoming Spencer Hibnick, aka Pesto Publications, to our RT Talks today. Everybody can hype Spencer up in the chat. How's it going, Spencer?
Good. Can't complain too much. So what do you got for me?
Yeah. Well, why don't we get right into it? So today we're going to be talking about playtesting, something that I'm told is your specialty. So I'm excited to cover three kind of pillars of conversation with you today. The first one is going to be kind of setting the stage, before we start a playtest. What should folks do? What kind of preparations or things should they know about? Then we're going to cover the second pillar, which is going to be more about during the playtest, how to make the most of it. And at the very end, I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of advice for people who want to playtest other people's games, so for playtesters. And of course, as always, at the very end of the show, if folks in the audience have questions that they think of during the conversation that you would like Spencer to cover live, we have a thread that you can go to. So kind of above this in the Discord server, there's an RT Talks discussions channel. If you click on that channel, there should be a thread there for today's conversation that, if I'm not mistaken, DeMille has already posted in the chat. So if you have stuff that you'd like Spencer to cover, please go and check it out. And if you're listening post conversation, you're here on, podcast land or YouTube land or whatever, and you want the opportunity to do that, you're going to have to come join us for our next RT Talk. So anyway, let's start with things that we should do before we start playtesting. And something that I think we should maybe cover that might be relevant is kind of the frequency of playtesting. I've heard that in a couple of different spaces that playtesting early and often is important. This was specifically advice that I heard in a board gaming panel about playtesting board games. And I'm curious to know, does that advice stand true in the TTRPG space, and why?
Yeah, it is. It's absolutely true with a big caveat. The big caveat is that you need to have something that's ready to put in front of playtesters to put in front of playtesters, which is sort of not a very useful statement. It's important for you to start testing early enough because you want to make sure your core systems work before you spend time building things that rely on those core systems. If you're building a new RPG, you want to make sure your dice mechanic works before you start building out the rest of the RPG. Otherwise, you're going to put in a huge amount of work that you have to redo. However, you need to make sure that you have everything that you need for a session written and in a state that you believe in before you run a test. So, for example, if you're running a new RPG and it's a combat-centric RPG, you're going to want to have a draft of the core dice mechanic. You're going to want to have the first level of the classes. You're going to want to have your first draft of the monsters. Going in knowing a lot of things are going to change, but you really don't want to just wing it and say, I'll build systems on the fly or I'll build content on the fly. But once you have enough content to run a test and you've done your internal read through and made sure it makes sense to you, then yeah, I would start testing.
So it sounds to me like there might be a stage where it's too early, and that's kind of before you've really got it all figured out, right? The core elements figured out.
Yeah, because ultimately, you're not... I'm stealing this from either James Intercasso or Matt Colville. I forget which one. You can't ship a copy of yourself with the game. So the rules that you are writing need to be complete enough that the person that is testing them can read them and understand them, or understand 90% of them and know what questions to ask at the start of the test. Otherwise, you're sort of just wasting everyone's time. I have been in tests where things were incomplete and I did not have enough information in order to play my character, and I had a ton of questions just about how things worked, and the person running the test had answers to maybe 2/3 of them, and it wound up not being terribly useful because you're ultimately testing what's on paper, what's real. You can't test what's in the GM's head.
That makes a whole lot of sense to me. And kind of in that same realm of question, Spencer, I'm thinking about then, depending on when you playtest your game, you're probably going to be looking to get feedback different things, right? When it's at the very, very early stages, like you were saying, it's on some of these more fundamental, foundational elements, core mechanics of the game. Whereas if it's later on, it might be about, I don't know, balance or some of the more advanced elements of the creation. I'd be curious to know if you could walk us through the kind of different phases a game might require, or not require playtesting, but where playtesting might help kind of along the milestones of a game's creation.
So this is a surprisingly hard thing to answer because every product is going to be different.
Mm.
If you are writing an adventure, if you're writing a small collection of stat blocks, if it's a small project, then throw out everything I said before. You're probably just going to test it once everything is written and then iterate on the entire project whole. If you're testing a larger project like a new system or a 200-page crowdfunded project that has multiple chapters, then you can break it out by chapter. But ultimately, it has to serve the needs of the individual project.
Mm-hmm.
So my rule of thumb would be whenever you are looking at what you have and say, I need to make sure this works before I can build on top of it, that's when you would want to test. So if you're building a system from scratch, then you're going to want to be running more tests because you're going to want to make sure that each system works before you're able to build systems that interact with it. If you're building off of an existing system, whether that's 5e or Forge of the Dark or anything like that, and you're relatively comfortable with the core system that you're building off of, then you wouldn't necessarily need to run as many tests and wouldn't need to run them as early because the foundations are strong. So you would be, if it's an adventure, you probably would have the first full session, the first 4 hours of content written out
Mm-hmm.
before you test it, or the whole adventure. So yeah, it's that rule of thumb, the making sure that it works before you build on top of it is really the only constant.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I know it's kind of hard too because the TTRPG Rising Tide community kind of has folks in all of the corners of this, right? There are people making smaller, one-page RPGs or resources and adventures, and then other folks making full-blown, massive systems and all of that. So maybe I'll take a question that we got here from somebody in the community who's making a bigger game, just to kind of contextualize that a bit more. So this is from Thomas Gimenez Rioja, and I'm sorry, Thomas, I definitely mispronounced that. His question is, I have a big game and want to playtest it, and specifically start building a community around it. Do you have any advice or tips for gathering and finding effective playtesters? And I really like the part about kind of building a community around it. So I'd be curious to know your thoughts.
Sure. So first things first is you need a community hub, somewhere where you can reach out to a bunch of people at once to recruit testers.
Mm.
In my case, it's my testing Discord server, which is publicly open. You can get to it from my website. I post to it on social media from time to time. I post to it in my newsletter from time to time. I want people to join because the more people that are in that server, the higher likelihood it is that when I say, hey, I'd like to schedule a test, who's available at 7:30 on a Thursday, that I'm going to be able to get enough people for a test. I've also seen, I know MT Black does this. MT Black, big 5e creator, has a massive mailing list that is his general mailing list, and then has a smaller mailing list for people that have opted into testing that he will hit when he's looking for people to test. Either way, you just need to identify who's interested in testing, and it needs to be opt-in, and you need a way to get the call out to all of them at once. And unfortunately, like everything else in the TTRPG community, building a community takes time and you never stop building it. So it's just one more responsibility that you have to juggle to make this whole crazy, weird thing we all do work. The good thing is that your testing community is an extension of your regular community, and you need a regular community to sell products to, for lack of a more tactful way of saying it. So as your community grows, the pool of people that are willing to test your stuff hopefully also grows. But it's really just putting in the footwork of building a community, which is a lot harder now that Twitter has sort of gone down the drain and everything is fragmented, but that's always been the case. It's a tremendously fragmented industry. You need to find a niche, you need to find a way to communicate that niche, and you need to hope that people will come.
Yeah, that's really solid advice, and I think having a community for yourself with folks who are dedicated to your work, like you're saying, Spencer, it's going to benefit for more than just playtesting. I think when folks are just getting started, communities like this one though is a pretty good first step. If I'm not mistaken, and I should know this, but if I'm not mistaken, we have a playtesting role here in the TTRPG Rising Tide Discord community. So folks can, look for people to help playtest. At the very least, there's text channels for collaboration where you can ask if there are folks who would be willing to kind of come and play, give it a shot. I'm sure there's more granular rules, so make sure you go check the rules of the server to make sure you're not spamming it.
Yeah, there better be a playtesting role in this server. Otherwise, I don't know why it says playtester next to my name in the server. One thing I did mean to mention and did not in my original answer, I have never done this myself, but I know that one popular thing to try to get testing when you don't have a big community is playtesting exchanges, which is I'll test your things if you test my things. They don't always work. It involves trust and people following through, and sometimes even with best intentions, TTG has to take a backseat to life. And if you get sick or there's a family emergency or what have you, your plans on joining their test after they test your things might fall through. But ultimately, communities like this, or the looking for group subreddit r/LFG, or the D&D Beyond LFG, or the Roll20 LFG, or the Fantasy Grounds LFG, or the Foundry LFG, these general purpose areas, assuming that you read the rules of the recruiting and follow them, are a good place to get started when you don't have a community.
Yeah, that's a really good good caveat for sure. Maybe one more question kind of in this space, Spencer, as it pertains to preparing. And maybe we'll shift gears a little bit, talk a little bit about mental health maybe. I know that putting a game out there to have people play test, it can be daunting. It can also be kind of hard to hear so much feedback from folks. Do you have any advice for people looking to kind of build resilience, preparing themselves for the onslaught that is getting feedback from potentially from strangers?
So I think one important thing is you need to frame how testing is in your mind. And let me start over. Someone that is going to volunteer to spend 4 hours playing a game with you and offering feedback is someone that is in your corner and wants you to succeed. Because otherwise, why the heck are they spending 4 hours of their time in a room with you? So these are people that ultimately want your project to be successful. And some people are going to be more tactful than others. And some people are going to offer higher quality feedback than others. And sometimes you're going to get someone that really rips into it. But it helps to keep in mind, these are all people that are doing this because they want your project to be successful. And so, yeah, it can sting for all of your carefully laid plans to be laid bare and for people to say, yeah, that didn't work for me, or yeah, that wasn't balanced. And it can really sting if 5 minutes into the test, you realize that you made some core assumptions that don't hold up and a lot of things are going to need to change. But the people that are doing this, their hearts are in the right place, for lack of a better term. They are doing this to help you. It is going to make your project better. And so if you go in with that mindset, it stings a lot less. The other thing I would say is, even for small projects, like I'm a contract tester. There are people that have reached out to me and said, please test my 4-hour adventure, and I will come back to them with an itemized list of bugs. And even for a 4-hour adventure, it can be like 50 different things.
Mm-hmm.
It can be a long list, and that can be overwhelming. So the other thing that I would say is, you don't need to solve every problem that is raised in one session. You can take the time, and should take the time, to look over the feedback, tackle things in small bits, make an order that works for you. Do you want to start at the beginning and work your way through? Do you want to tackle what you see are the biggest issues and see what else resolves itself as you go on? But when you get a wall of feedback, you can't just face plant the wall and expect to come out healthy on the other side. You have to look at it as a to-do list. And like any to-do list, you bite off as much as you can chew at one time, and then you take a break, and then you go back to the well and bite off more until it's
Mm-hmm.
back into a place that you believe in again.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice.
Yeah, and I guess one last thing, which this is as much suited for other places in this discussion later on as it is now. Ultimately, you are the author, and it has to be something you believe in. And if a lot of people are saying, hey, this doesn't work, then it's probably an issue.
Mm.
But if you are going to get feedback where someone says, I don't like this, and you look at it and you say, yeah, but I believe in it. And sometimes that might change after several tests, or as your understanding of what the project is ultimately going to look like changes. But if you don't believe in the project at the end, and you're not happy with the project at the end, no one else is going to like it. You have to be the first champion for this project. So just because you get feedback does not mean that it is something that needs to change. And just because if there are things that you look at and say, this would compromise my vision, then you do have the veto power to say, no, I mean, I have to go with my gut and my vision on this. Don't let the feedback destroy your vision or your excitement in the project.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important thing to say because you're right. You know, at the end of the day, this is in most cases, you know, this is something that you've created, you've poured in a lot of your heart and soul into something. So it's sometimes hard to draw that line, but at the end of the day, the ultimate core vision of a product, you're gonna want to hang on to that. And sometimes maybe that core vision doesn't suit this product, so you could perhaps recycle it for something else. And you know, Spencer, that kind of segues really nicely into the second pillar of our conversation, which is to talk about stuff that happens during a playtest. So maybe we can talk a little bit about feedback and how to best collect and store that feedback. I know we got a couple different questions from a few different folks. One came from Chris, who's here. Hey, Chris. Chris Hopper asked a question, and also Zwack asked a question, kind of a similar nature, where the question was about how to collect and store feedback from your playtesters in a way that kind of enables you to identify issues in the game and where you might need to make changes. And Chris specifically asked to get into the nitty gritty. So if you have like a spreadsheet or like something that you
Chris
used.
knows that I have a spreadsheet because Chris edited my guide to testing and made the custom URL for my spreadsheet. So I don't know what he's up on, but yes, I guess this is as good a time as any to mention it. I have a free guide to testing, appropriately called Pesto's Guide to Testing. It is on itch. It is the last remaining thing I have on DriveThruRPG. It is on Amazon if you want to have it printed for some reason. It was stretch goal. I don't know why I did that. But in that guide, there is a link to my bug tracker. And by my bug tracker, I mean my adaptation of the bug tracker MCDM has been using for all of their products for the last 5 years. And it is basically a bunch of Excel sheets. And thank you for the link. Yes, it is pestopublications.itch.io, and then it is Pesto's Guide to Testing. And the The bug tracker link is on page 26 in the section appropriately called Bug Tracker. But basically what that is it is a series of fields. There is a where is this bug field. There is a what is a summary of this bug field. And there is an additional details field, and that is optional. And then there is a drop down for what type of bug this is, which is useful for if you want to tackle all the bugs of one specific type or not. But basically, the way I have always tracked bugs is by putting them all in a spreadsheet. And you want that each line in the spreadsheet to be at the discrete bug level. So there is a temptation, if you are giving feedback or if you're writing feedback, to lump multiple issues that seem related together. So for example, if you're testing a monster and the monster is really difficult, more difficult than you were expecting it to be, and you've observed, oh, this monster's health is much too high, oh, this monster's AC is much too high, and also, oh, it hits like a truck, and you weren't expecting any of these things. What you're going to want to do is resist the temptation to create one bug, this monster is too strong. And instead, you're going to want to break that out into 2 or 3 bugs, depending on how granular you're going to want to be. Because you have one issue, which is it's much harder to kill than you expected. You have another issue, it's doing much more damage than you expected. And the reason why it's super important to get this granular is because it's very easy when you have 50 or 100 bugs for things to get lost in the shuffle. And one thing I didn't mention about the bug tracker spreadsheet is that there's a drop down for, is this resolved or not? Is this on hold or not? And it will change the highlighting of that row so you can at a glance see what you still need to work on. And when there's so many things to keep track of, if you have big bugs with lots of elements, it's too easy to forget one of those elements. So you could take this bug about the monster that's too strong, and you could reduce its HP and its AC and say, okay, this is resolved. And forget, oh yeah, it's also hitting like a truck. And now all of a sudden, either it's your next test or the project is shipped, and people are complaining that this monster is killing them in one turn. What the heck is going on? And you're like, I could have sworn there was a bug about that. I could have sworn it's resolved. Oh, crap. So yeah, put everything in a bug sheet. Don't be afraid of duplicates. You can always come back and mark things as duplicates later. Put them in. During the test, I have a steno, which is like a legal pad, but half of a size. And I write down notes during the test so that I can be reminded at the end of the test to talk with the testers about them. And then at the feedback session at the end of the test, I take detailed notes about what the testers are saying, and those go straight into the bug tracker. You need one centralized place to keep track of all the bugs, and that place needs to be something that is organized, because the more bugs you have, the easier it is for things to get lost. So just writing it down in a notebook, well, you better hope that you know where it is in that notebook, and that you didn't skip any pages, and that you didn't accidentally put your can of soda on top of that notebook, and now half of your test notes have a ring through them. So yeah, big believer in the spreadsheet.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a very valuable tool. I'm curious to note also, Spencer, if there are things that you might say to the people playtesting your game in order to kind of prime them to be able to give you the most relevant feedback. Is there kind of like a
Absolutely.
introduction that you like to have or what have you?
That would be page 28 of Pesto's Guide to Testing.
Awesome.
So yeah, there's a spiel. The spiel changes every test based on what you're testing, but basically you want to prime the testers on what they're getting into. Running a playtest is a lot like running a regular session, except that at the end you have a feedback period where you're asking some questions about what worked and what didn't work. But the mindset is different. So I tend to start off with an explanation of how the session is going to go. So if it's a 4-hour session, I'm going to say we're going to be playing through 2 or 3 combats. I want you to keep your eyes on what's working, what's not working, what feels balanced, what doesn't feel balanced. whatever it is that you're looking for, give them a quick heads up about what it is, and then say it. And then after we run through the combats, we're going to go through feedback. I'm going to ask you for your thoughts in the feedback session. I also want to stress, and this is the number one rule for play testers, or for players in playtests. The job of a tester is to identify issues, not develop solutions. It is solely the remit of the designer to figure out how to solve these issues. And you want to set that expectation early and often, because the fastest way to waste 45 minutes of feedback time is for people to try to solve it and argue back and forth and not get a chance to cover everything else. So you want the testers to know, hey, you should be framing this as, this is an issue I encountered. You should not be framing it as, and here's how I think you should solve it, or offering design advice or anything like that. A, because it dilutes the clarity of the issues that are being raised. B, they are not the designers. They might not necessarily know what your vision is. There are messy legal issues if you suddenly start using other people's design. It's just way easier. And then the last things that I would stress are, if it's a game where you're building characters, you need to build with the test in mind, but not build for the test. Which is to say, if you're in a test, yes, the banishments, if you're testing a bunch of 5e monsters, yes, we all know the banishment spell exists. But if you banish the monster, we can't see how it works in combat, and therefore it's not a very valuable test. So you want to be running your character as close to how you would run it at a regular table as possible. You want to have the conditions of the test be as close to the average table as possible, with the caveat that you are in a test. Don't do things like banish or imprisonment or build a character. There's a list of subclasses that the MCDM testers, the coordinators, had banned over the course of testing Flea Mortals because they're too good at breaking tests. Like the samurai that can instantly kill a monster on the first turn and therefore we don't get data. Or any flavor of artificer who just hands out AC like it's Halloween candy and all of a sudden all of our balance math is off. So build with the test in mind, but yeah, keep combat moving. You're going to want to get through. You're only going to have this one session. If it's a one session test, get through as much content as you can. So you're going to want to limit the table talk and all of that. I tend to hang out after the test if people want to chat, because it is a social activity, but I also want to make sure that the testing gets done. And then just general good table behavior. I have it in the guide as, don't have your fun at the expense of others, but it's very easy when you have 5 people that are giving feedback for someone to be talking over everyone else, because they're very excited to share their opinion, or because chat over the internet is asynchronous and they start talking without realizing someone else had also started talking. So as the facilitator of the test, you're going to want to keep an eye on that and make sure that everyone has an opportunity to offer feedback and feels welcomed to do so and isn't being talked over, and that everyone is treating each other with respect.
That's fantastic advice. And I think it covered a lot of different areas, which I can appreciate how it, all of this is very interconnected. So it's definitely advisable for people to have resources to help them. And I think that your playtesting guide is a fantastic source for folks to check out. So Demil posted that already, I think, in the thread, if people haven't had a chance to go check it out. But I highly recommend it. Speaking of trying to get as much done as you can during a playtest, Spencer, we got a handful of questions from the community that kind of related to, and I'm kind of generalizing now, but the struggle of trying to test the full loop of a role-playing game, especially when you might have a game that has different pillars in it. You have downtime activities, perhaps, or character progression and things like this. So I'd love to know any advice you might have for folks listening who might have a hard time making the best use of that, 3-hour block of time that you might have with your playtesters, or maybe it's at a convention or something like that where you only have a small window. what should folks focus on? How can they break it down the best they can to kind of make the most of a playtest?
So the first thing I would say is you are not going to test the entire TTRPG loop in one 3-hour session. Or I saw someone say 90 minutes, and I'm like, I don't even know how you would do 90 minutes. If you are testing in a convention, if the only window of testing you have is a 3-hour block in a convention, and that's it, that's all the testing that's going to the product, I would say, what is the most important thing that I want to test? And you build the encounter around that. If you have a broader testing platform program, either you have a bunch of tests scheduled or you have a contract tester that's going to be able to do a lot of tests, or you have an ongoing campaign that you can shoehorn the content into, then you can break out the different elements into different tests. So, for example, the MCDM RPG Draw Steel is in development right now, and I am one of the testers on that. And early on, we did a lot of focus on the core combat mechanic. But then there are other systems that we would test separately. We would test the montage tests, the out of combat using skills to resolve a cinematic moment as a separate part of a test when that piece was online, or negotiations, the social combat
Mhm.
would be part of its own test. And sometimes if you've got 4 hours and the negotiation is only going to take the first hour, then you have other things you can fit into it. But you're going into the test with an idea of what are the most important things to test, making sure that those are put in first and foremost and are scheduled out for. You're not going to be able to test an entire TTRPG, the entire core loop in one test.
Mhm.
But on the other side of the coin, you're typically not going to have the entire TTRPG loop in one gameplay session. Not every session every week is going to have negotiation and montages and combat and the obligatory shopping episode and what have you. So again, you're going to want your tests to sort of resemble how actual play happens so that the feedback you get is grounded in the reality of play. Don't try to force too many things that are it's just going to make it harder for you to keep track of what's going on, for the players to keep track of what's going on. Your feedback is going to get muddled. Prioritize what you're going to test as you're planning these tests based on what needs eyes on it urgently, what is in a state that is ready to put on in front of other people, and go into the test with, I want this piece tested, I want that piece tested. Don't try to do the whole loop in one sitting. You'll get there eventually. And then lastly, I would say, if you have a group of friends that like playing TTRPGs with you, being able to spin up a campaign and have that campaign be your test, it needs to be late enough in the project life cycle that you have a lot of elements and can actually run a campaign. But just putting things in front of people organically as they would come up in a campaign is going to be very valuable, because it will A, expose things that really only come up over long-term play, and B, it gives you an opportunity to get lots of testing in without it necessarily being in the framework of, here's a 3-hour block that we're going to be doing some testing.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really solid advice. And I think, like you said, breaking it down is it's got to be the only way to do it, or getting your table of friends to play. I maybe have one last question here as it pertains to what to do during playtesting and with feedback and whatnot. So real quick, we got a question here from Tom Bombadil in the server, who was talking to us about how do we know when our game has been playtested enough?
So, how much time do you have left before the ship date? Things in every MCDM product, things were getting tweaked all the way up until the print deadline. But they have a war chest funded by 7-figure Kickstarters and a large Patreon to keep pounding at testing for an infinite amount of time. But that is the platonic ideal. In reality, the first test you run, you're going to get a huge amount of feedback. and you're going to fix all the problems, and then you're going to run another test, and you're going to get less feedback because there's less issues.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to repeat that process, and at some point you're going to run a test, and you're going to get some feedback, but it's not going to be 50 items. It's not going to take you hours and hours to rewrite it. This is, unfortunately, testing is a skill. You get better at it the more you do it, and your sense for how much testing is the right amount of testing is a sense that you develop over time. But yeah, expect the most feedback to be early on. The more tests you run, the less feedback you're going to get. You will always run, when you run tests, assuming that you have competent players, you will always get feedback. But at some point, the amount of feedback that you're getting and the improvements to the product that you're getting from it are going to be incremental and no longer worth the time of spending 4 hours running a test. And you'll develop that feel.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that's great advice. You know what? I know I said there was going to be 3 pillars, and that the third one would be about, playtesters and advice for them. But there's quite a few questions that came in, and I think unless you have like a quick shot advice for playtesters, Spencer, you want to take a stab at a quick answer for people listening who are playtesters? What kind of advice you might give for people like testing a game that are the players, and then we can jump into the audience questions.
Yeah, I think I talked a lot about that in the primer,
Mm-hmm.
framed from the coordinator's point of view. But yeah, I mean, your job is to identify issues, not develop solutions. Look at it from a player's perspective. What's working and what's not working, what feels balanced and what doesn't feel balanced. You are a TTRPG player. You know how things should feel. Even if it's not a system you're familiar with, you have these muscles developed from years of play. You should know, hey, this doesn't feel right. I'm playing this paladin and I'm doing a smite and it's doing half of the table's damage and there's 4 other players. This doesn't seem right. But yeah, I mean, as long as share your observations, be respectful, make sure everyone at the table has an opportunity to talk, but the coordinator should be letting you know what it is they're looking for. So I would try to take down some notes when things like that come up. But yeah, you're there to play the TTRPG, and at the end, they're going to ask you some questions, answer honestly, and that's really all you need to do.
Awesome.
You don't need to come up with some great insights. All the little things that you're pointing out are the great insight.
Perfect. Yeah, no, I think that's a good perspective to have, right? We're there for you to identify problems. So perfect. We have 6 questions now from our live audience. So I'm gonna go through them, Spencer, and we only have about 13 minutes on the clock. So I'll try to be as efficient as I can. We have a question here from Lex. Lex Vex asks, how should I format large testing, and what is the best format for testing / scaling? How much content is too much to test, etc.
So when you are running a test, it is very similar to running a regular session, with the only differences being that you're going to want to block off some time at the end for your feedback discussion. And you're going to want to make sure that during the prep, before the test begins, that you are framing what's going on so that people know what they're getting into, what to expect during a test. But you, as a person that has run RPGs before, should have a pretty good sense for how much content is going to be able to be gotten through at a specific amount of time. So if you have a 4-hour test, you're blocking off 15 minutes for distractions and 45 minutes for feedback at the end. That gives you 3 hours of testing time. Do you have enough content to fill 3 hours? All right. If the players are especially efficient, do you have enough content for all 4 hours? You don't need to have everything ready, but you should have enough that you would be confident that you have a full session prepped if you were running this as a regular game.
Very, very solid answer. Lex Vex also had a little addition there, and I separated it out intentionally because Lex asked your thoughts on the viability of paid testers.
There's 2 different things in there. There is paid coordinators and there is paid testers. I am a freelance playtest coordinator. I will read through your content, run it, provide itemized feedback in one of those spreadsheets back to you as a service. I cannot afford to pay my testers. However, I very strongly believe that anyone that tests your product should get a free digital copy. I have that in my freelance contract. If I run tests for you, as part of that, you must give a free digital copy to all the testers. You need to treat your volunteers right. It is a no-brainer. It is the right way to treat people. It is how you get people to come back. And it is important to your reputation in the industry that you don't screw people over. But I can't afford to pay my testers. I don't have that kind of budget. But a paid coordinator, that is something that I have done before and is something I'm happy to chat with people about. Someone who will run tests for you and give feedback. I think that that's viable if you have a big enough budget. But we're talking, I would not do that for someone if they said my budget is in the 3 figures, because I think more important is going to be art and editing to the ultimate success of your project, because you need people to look at it first and pick it up off of the shelf, digital or physical, before you can even get into the quality. Once you get into the 4 and especially the 5-figure ultimate budgets, at that point, having a tester or 2 that are running tests in addition to you, that becomes valuable. And I do discuss that in the guide to testing if you want more details, because I know we still have a couple questions and there's 10 minutes left.
Yeah, awesome. I think that's really solid advice, Spencer, and I'm sure getting somebody else to run the playtest session for you kind of offers a unique perspective to, right, on how the game runs and stuff like that. All right, yeah, we still have 4 questions, so we'll sorry to put you kind of on the firing line here, Spencer.
One of them's real fast. I know that.
Yeah, perfect. Well, let's go to that one. Let's give ourselves an easy one. NDAs, when, why, and what to include.
I don't believe in NDAs. If you can't trust someone, don't put your content in front of them. If you can trust them, you don't need an NDA. I will say, when I am a freelancer and I am testing for other people, there is a contract. Never, ever, whether you're a writer, a tester, an artist, whatever you are doing in this industry, never go into a project without a contract. If someone does not want to do a contract, that is a red flag. You should bail on that project. Always, always, always have a contract. NDAs, on the other hand, I don't think they're worth the paper they're printed on. The value of an NDA is entirely based on how much you trust the person to stay within the terms of that NDA, and nothing you are doing, unless there is secretly someone in here that is working for a Marvel property and has millions of dollars tied up in their project, in which case call me. But nothing you are doing is so important that you really need an NDA. It's just going to get in the way. It's a mess. You don't need it. Trust people or don't. Next question.
Yeah, next question. This one's from Zwack. And Zwack asks, similar to what was mentioned about characters being OP like the samurai or artificer, is it ever okay to make tweaks to the system part way through the playtest?
Yes, I have done that. I do that frequently because if you realize there is a problem and it's going to derail the test and you realize it half an hour in, then you should probably try to fix it before you waste another 3 hours of people's time. However, very important, if you are making changes during the test, you need to write down what those changes are during the test so that when the test is over, you remember what you changed. Otherwise, you might be looking at your feedback a couple weeks later, forget that you've made those changes, and you're going to draw the wrong conclusions. So yes, feel free to make changes during the test. Try to limit them to what is strictly necessary. You don't want to be doing too much improv, otherwise you're not actually testing what's written down. But if you need to make those changes, you have the license to do so. Just make sure you're writing down what you're changing so that you remember to look at the feedback you collect through the lens of what has been changed.
Awesome. Next question is from Lex Vex again, and Lex's question is as follows. Traditional TTRPGs have a unique scaling of high-level play. How would you go about testing the quote-unquote end game or late game, which typically gets more extreme in scale?
All right. Well, putting aside that I think balance is a myth at Tier 4 play in D&D, where everything is crazy and the points don't matter, there is no rule that you have to test starting at level 1 and going through to level 20. if you have content that is high level, you can just create a test and say, hey, everyone, please make 17th level character. Typically, when if I'm doing a contract test for a class, a 5e class or a subclass, I will run it at tier 2 play because levels 1 and 2 I think are pretty useless. And most of the time, and most of the more advanced features that people are going to be interacting with a lot come online levels 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So pick a level in there where all the features you want to test are already available to the characters. Start at tier 2. If your content is a higher level adventure or a higher level class or something like that, look at tier 2 and then look at high tier 3. Because chances are, by the time things are level 20, everything, the wheels of balance are going to fall out no matter what you do. The system is not stable at that level, but you can get a lot of value by looking at the core levels that people are playing in and absolutely target your tests towards the content you want to test.
Awesome. I think that, yeah, that makes good sense. Off to a question from John, Pathways to Adventure Dev. John asks, and John's been doing some playtesting on his own work, but he asks, is there a good point to pause testing and focus on implementing the feedback in bulk, or do you recommend making changes based on feedback as it comes in? And John's been doing a mixture of both.
What I would say is look at the feedback that has come in and try to adjust things before you start testing again. I think you're going to get much more value by addressing all of the problems that have been pointed out before you test again. Otherwise, some of the same problems are going to keep revisiting. The other thing is, if the changes you make have knock-on effects that you don't anticipate, then you're going to want to have all of those changes made so that those things are revealed in your next round of testing. The caveat to that is for a big project, you need to break it out into units. So if you're doing a test of 6 or 7 monsters, you can say, I can still test these other monsters unless you find like a system-wide issue. I don't need to wait until I finish fixing the kobolds before I test the goblins. But you do want to make sure that you address all the issues with the kobolds from the first test before you run a test with the kobolds in the second test, for all the reasons that I mentioned above.
Awesome. 2 last rapid fire questions for you, Spencer. One from Lex Vex saying, how do you identify and discard bad or unhelpful feedback in an appropriate and constructive way? And I think your tracker is probably, a really good tool for that. And you talk about caveats and foundation that you give kind of in your spiel at the beginning. I think that hopefully fields out most of them. But
yeah,
what would you do if you still had a couple bad feedback bits?
When people are giving feedback live at the table, I tell them straight up that everything that they say goes in the tracker. What I don't say is that I have the right to ignore any bugs I don't agree with once they're in the tracker. There are occasionally things that I will just not pass on to the client or discard immediately if I know that they are not useful, if I know that they are people trying to insert design or people coming at the content with a fundamental misunderstanding of what's going on. When I'm testing for other people, I will put in bugs that I don't necessarily agree with, as long as I think that they are valid opinions that logically sound, even if I don't agree with them. And I will occasionally note, hey, this is something that one of the testers said, I don't necessarily agree with it for A, B, C reason. I saw someone say, what is an invalid opinion? An invalid opinion would be something that is not grounded in what actually happened at the test. So, for example, if you are running a grimdark RPG and someone comes and into the test, and at the end of the test, like, it's really dark. I was hoping for something more upbeat. That is an extreme example, but basically, like anything in testing, it's a lot of feel that you develop over time. But if you look at a piece of feedback and say, this person is not coming at it from good faith, or this person is not coming at it understanding the objectives, that's what I mean by invalid. And again, I am writing all this down. You can choose to show the feedback session to players afterwards and ask if you've missed anything. But once you start working on it and marking bugs as will fix, won't fix, at that point I don't show it to people.
Mm-hmm.
Because one very good way to shut down a discussion when it's getting out of hand or getting very designy or when people are going off track is say, all right, I've written that down. What else do we have? With the understanding that the design suggestions are not going to be what you're acting on. The underlying issues are going to be what you're acting on.
Yeah, no, and I think it's kind of unavoidable, right? At some point, you're going to get feedback from somebody that is based in their personal preferences, and if it's like you were saying, goes against the core tenets and the objectives of the game that you're trying to run or the tone of the game, sometimes you're going to get feedback because the player that's playing the game just doesn't like to play horror games, for instance.
Or, unfortunately, sometimes people don't read the content before and come in with a
Mhm.
half understanding of the rules, and
Yeah,
they'll point out something that's contradicted by the text.
yeah, that's it.
That happens too.
And yay or nay, as far as audio recordings go, Brendan asks, is it helpful to have audio recordings of your playtest?
It is not something I personally do. My strategy is take lots of notes as I go and then transcribe them. If you need an audio recording in order to feel confident that you're capturing everything, that is certainly valid as well. The one thing I would say is make sure that everyone who is participating in the test knows that it is being recorded and is okay with that.
Awesome. And I think that takes us to the end, Spencer. We did it.
Huzzah!
Thank you, first and foremost. This has been a really, really fantastic conversation. Before we say our goodbyes, I wanted to pass the microphone over to you if you had any last thoughts or parting words as it has to do with playtesting our games. And also, of course, I want to give you the opportunity to plug and share and remind us all of the stuff you've got in the works that you want us to know about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the final note I would give on testing is something I said at the very beginning. Keep in mind that everyone that is helping you test is in your corner. They want you to succeed. They are doing this to help you. Make sure that you treat these people right. Give them digital copies. Make sure they're credited how they want to be credited. It's good for community building. It's good for how you're perceived in the industry. It's just the right thing to do. And yeah, in terms of if you're looking to have someone test your content for you, that is a service that I offer. If you're looking for Pesto's Guide to Testing, there is a link there. You can find that the Pesto's Guide to Testing there. It is free unless it's the print on demand. In that case, can't make those free. Wish I could. And yeah, you can find me at Twitter and Blue Sky, mostly Blue Sky, at Pesto Enthusiast. And you can find me on itch at pestopublications.itch.io. You can find my website with my portfolio and all the links to everything, including my testing Discord at pestopublications.com. And that's everything I've got. And if you're interested in Draw Steel, the MCDM RPG, I've got some currently free while they're in early access content for that. I've got some adventures and some other content for 5e. But yeah, check it all out. And if you have any questions, let me know.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Spencer. I know that DeMille is working on posting, the links to your socials and website and stuff also in the chat. So, or not in the chat, but in the RT Talks discussion forum. So folks can go check that out, whether that be, if you're following us now live or if you're coming in a little bit later with a recording, you can come check out all of Spencer's links.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess the last thing to say is once again, thank you, Spencer. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and you're a trove of knowledge as it pertains to playtesting. So thank you.
Absolutely. Good luck, everyone.
While folks sign off and go and follow Spencer on all of the social media platforms of your choosing, I'd like to encourage you to follow the TTRPG Rising Tide account on X, Blue Sky, Threads, and other places too, I'm sure. We appreciate it if you can share the good word of this community. We grow because of you sharing the word and the good word of the TTRPG Rising Tide Discord server as an amazing place for, TTRPG creatives to help one another out. So if you can continue to spread the word, we'd greatly appreciate it. And that's kind of it for me. So I'm Matt at roll_play_chat on all socials. And I hope you can join us live for the next episode of RT Talks. Maybe this is a good time to say you can go listen to some of the old content. If you missed some of the older episodes, we've been doing this now for quite some time. There's a couple dozen episodes out there, if not more. I can, my sense of time is terrible. I think it's probably been a couple years that we've been doing this, but now I forget. But anyway, I'm rambling. Thank you, Spencer. Thank you, everybody here. And remember that a rising tide lifts all boats. We'll see you all next time.